All right, thanks everyone for coming back. So if you haven't registered, maybe some of you have just arrived now, we would ask that you register at the table past these back doors and to your left. I'm curious, I know David already asked this, but raise your hand if you're an Episcopalian. I just want to get a sense. You're an Episcopalian. Raise your hand if you're an Episcopalian. Okay, raise your hand if you're Roman Catholic. Wow, great turnout. Okay, and then there's UCC. A few of you, 4 of you. And what other? You were UCC before you were Episcopalian. What other traditions am I forgetting? Not Christian. Great, great. Lovely. So grateful that you're here. Secular, right? Secular Jewish, wonderful. Okay. What's that? Well, Karen used to be Presbyterian, but Karen Price is a full-fledged Episcopalian. I saw it, I witnessed it. But Pastor Dan was here. He had to go down to Santa Rosa. How was the lunch? Is it good? It was a lot. Yes. Yes, so who do we thank? Elizabeth Harper Lawson, thank you for that lunch. Thank you, Gigi. Thank you, Rich. Mary Organist. Thank you, Mary Organist. And I want to thank Paul Gossard and Heidi Erickson, who are recording this. It's not live streamed. We wanted people to be here in person. And we also want this to be a safe space. I appreciate you guys making this feel safe enough for me to be vulnerable when I just was overwhelmed with Betty Chin's saying yes and Karen Price's beautiful illustration of her story in The Gray Bird Sings. So if there's something you want to share that comes up, David will be here in just a moment. And you say, I'd rather that not be on the internet, just let me know. We'll edit that out. Well, we want this to be a safe space for you. And then the slides, I'll have those in the recording, which should be available probably the next week or so. Are there any questions about kind of housekeeping or the rest of the afternoon before we jump back in? Yes, thank you. Right. I remember saying that at the Betty Chin event. You can come back tomorrow, and everybody laughed because I was trying to plug Christ Church. But I am plugging Christ Church, but I was plugging Karen Price as our preacher. Now, this weekend, David Odorizio will be preaching at the 8 o'clock and 10:30 service. Yes.
They came back. My dream was not a prophecy fulfilled. Okay. Let's sit again briefly together, just for a few minutes. Is that okay? Okay. So time is a gift. So are our bodies. My body's very happy. Got to eat a donut. So let's just take a moment to thank our bodies. There's so much damage and trauma that certain messages from the Christian tradition about our bodies being bad or somehow sinful. Our bodies are the vessel. Our bodies are the vessel for God. Just take a deep breath in. Thank you. Thank you, Lord, for this life. And if it feels right, invoke your sacred word or your mantra. And if you can, this is something from the Eastern Christian tradition. There's a practice called hesychasm, sort of like a Christian form of yoga. And part of that practice is to just gently extend the head down towards the heart. Bringing the chin down towards the chest and bringing your attention, bringing your mind, your awareness into the heart center. And if it feels appropriate or comfortable for you, imagine that name, that sacred word, imagine that you're planting that like a seed in your heart. And breathe it in. If that word is love, if that word is God, whatever the word is, just see if you can breathe it in and bring it more to life in the heart. Take one more breath in together. And exhale. And once again, wiggling the fingers and toes. Bringing your awareness back into your body, into this space. And if it feels right, just take a look around. Once again, allow your eyes just to gently rest or follow somebody maybe next to you, or just give them a little nod. I see you shining like the sun. I see you shining like the sun. Thanks, everybody. So, where we left off, we just fell through the bottom of everything, and we came out in God. And then we ate lunch. How did that go for you? Are you with me when this? Does this resonate with people?
In Jewish tradition, when someone passes away, you recite the Kaddish. And if you read the Kaddish, there's nothing about the person that passes. It's a praise of God the whole time. And it comes from the concept that we're all a piece of God. And so when we pass, that piece that is God has just returned to God. And so in reciting the Kaddish and in praising God, you are simultaneously praising God and the person that you've lost. And so that's part of the reason why you recite it for several days, and then you do it on the year anniversaries of the passing. And it's just to remind oneself that your loved one is with God and that you're also a piece of God in that whole praise. So I think that that's another tradition to add into this.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Any other questions about, questions. The whole thing is a question. We just sort of found ourselves in the deepest mystery of the deepest mystery.
Your genuine self is in God, so in discovering your genuine self, you discover God. That theme preceded these conferences where he's discovered the similar themes in other religions. Am I reading that right?
Yeah. Sorry, I had a wardrobe malfunction. So, if I heard you, and if I didn't, correct me. Merton's notion of the true and the false self precedes these conferences. Yeah. So, it's interesting. This notion of the true and the false self is probably one of the most popular and popularized things in Merton. And it's not like he ever wrote a book about it, but it's in so many of his books. And New Seeds of Contemplation is certainly one of them. But it's a metaphor that he plays with throughout his life. In his writings in the 1950s on Bernard of Clairvaux, in his novitiate conferences on the history of the Cistercian order, in his book The New Man, in New Seeds of Contemplation, and then in his interfaith work. He's constantly, it's this theme of lost and found. It's the theme of the expulsion from the garden and the return. It's constant, and it's a deeply monastic theme that Merton is standing within that Cistercian and in that patristic tradition, doing this kind of lifelong exegesis of basically the Genesis account. How do we betray our authentic selves? How do we betray the trust of the Creator? And then how do we repair? This is fundamental human relational dynamics, right? It's about this being lost and found, right? So that's what he's doing, this sort of comparative mysticism with this theme of of truth and falsehood, authenticity versus duplicity, right? And we're sort of rotating around this, and that's where he takes us with the yoga material and with the Islamic Sufi material. Does that make sense?
Do you think that theme is what he's searching in other religions for? Is that what he's looking for corroboration of that idea in other faiths? Because it's not just a general curiosity. He's not just curious about other religions. He's looking specifically
Yeah.
at these religions for his commonality.
Yeah, I think it's because it's him. It just goes back to sort of how I introduced his biography. I think Merton is looking for himself. He's looking for himself in relationship to his God, and he's doing that and exploring all of the different avenues in which he can find a language and an approach. And we haven't talked about Tibetan Buddhism because I'm trying to focus somewhat here, but the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is where he lands.
When you're talking about, is he searching in other religious traditions for a confirmation of that? I don't think that's what Merton was doing. Merton, when one enters into interreligious dialogue, one is always rooted in one's particularity. And Father Daniel spoke to this early on when you said that Merton, for you, allowed you to find that deep center, and then it opens you up to listen to others. And it's not that you're trying to listen for something that will somehow mirror what you know. It's that you're truly opened up to that reality that's presenting itself in that other person. And so in doing that, one becomes, sometimes there's resonances. And this is what, like the yoga and there's resonances. But what's key about Merton and about interreligious dialogue between adherents that are practicing deeply in their own particular tradition is they're opened up by that tradition simply to be present with each other. And the particularity of those experiences cannot be separated from the particularity of that tradition. And one doesn't even seek to do that. One simply seeks to hear the other and be brought into that reality by them without ever leaving one's own deep-rootedness. And it's an experience of stance rather than abstract idea.
It's very well articulated. Thank you. And it's a perfect segue for my next slide. I love when this happens. So, for Merton, and in the Sufi tradition, right, this is in the Sufi Islamic tradition, we fall through the bottom and we come out in God. And the Sufis, particularly Ibn Arabi, who you might have heard of, Ibn Arabi was probably referred to him as the greatest master. He's probably one of the greatest minds of the 12th century, as well as the Islamic world. And Merton does a whole thing with Ibn Arabi in the conferences. And part of what he does is he borrows from the Sufi tradition this notion of becoming a cosmic or a universal person. So remember, from this morning, Merton's approach to Islam is, again, following this notion of the true self. Islam tries to return us to our original, deep inner identity, our true self. Now, to frame this in the Sufi tradition, that if we wake up to who we are, and if we've said our yes, if we're faithful to this yes that we've made to God, and if we're able to ultimately let go of the ground of the self without leaving our own tradition, we fall through the bottom of that deep well, and we are transformed and we become cosmic, universal people. Now, what does he mean by this? This is a sort of a big, fancy term. What does it mean to become a universal person? When a person transcends all cultural limitations, a person becomes completely open, a cosmic person. A radical openness to all forms of religious experience. However, it's to be faithful to one's own religious tradition and at the same time to be not only completely aware of other traditions, but even to participate in their experience. And that is what I think Merton was looking for. I do not think, and most scholars agree, that Merton was not going to Asia to become, even though he does say in this book that he hopes to become as good a Buddhist as he can be. But there's no evidence that he was going there I don't think it would even be possible for him to leave his Catholic monastic Christianity behind. It was too much of the spiritual DNA in which he was clothed in. But I do think that he was very clearly going to India and going to Bangkok with the hope and the interest in participating in the experiences of other traditions, particularly that of Tibetan Buddhism. Right? So, in order to get to this point, and this is Merton in Santa Barbara, we must all get to the point of being universal persons. Okay, this notion of, he calls it a transcultural maturity. Transcultural maturity. That we have the ability to stand outside of our own national or ethnic or religious identities to fully embrace other humans, other persons, and the more than human world through this God-aligned consciousness, through this God-centered consciousness. We need to be universalized. It's a process of universalization. Right? This is deeply Christian. This is very Pauline. Right? All of creation is part of the body of Christ. And this is one of the key themes that we see in Merton's Asian Journal and the several talks that he gave at the end of his life. Okay, so and this is my own personal take. I'm sure others might disagree, but I think this notion of universal consciousness is really the key to his approach to interreligious dialogue. Right? It's about developing a form of universalism without what he calls a facile syncretism, without collapsing all these different traditions onto the same thing. He's not talking about sort of cafeteria-style spirituality where you just go from one dish to the next, unless it's like the lunch we had today, which was very delicious, especially the donuts. Did I mention the donuts? I think what he's really talking about is this notion of going deep. You have to be firmly rooted and committed to a particular practice that you're able to really develop and cultivate for a significant period of time in order for you to get to the point where you can drop down through the bottom of everything and then come out in God. Right? And then you find that all of a sudden there's all these other folks from all these other traditions that are also sort of orienting towards a similar kind of consciousness. And those are the folks that Merton wanted to meet. And he was hoping to meet. And this is, again, one of probably the most famous and often quoted paragraphs from his writings, and it was on the last day of his life, from a talk that he gave in Bangkok. If you penetrate to the inner secret of the ground of your ordinary experience, you attain to a liberty that nobody can touch, that nobody can affect, that no political change of circumstances can do anything to. Said in an election year, a very important election year. This kind of freedom and transcendence is somehow attainable. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a term for this. They call it the Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle. We can develop a kind of diamond-like. The thing about diamonds is that they're so durable and so extraordinarily hard that they're completely transparent. Maybe not completely, pretty transparent. They reflect light beautifully. How do we cultivate that diamond body? Right? And for Merton, it goes back to this notion of the secret and the inner secret of the heart penetrating into the ground of our ordinary experience. So what he's doing here in this phrase is that when you look at this talk that he gave in Bangkok on the last day of his life, when you look at it through the lens of his Redwoods conferences, you can see all the different themes that we've just gone through crystallized into this final talk that he gave hours before he dies. This notion of the inner secret, that's language from the Sufi tradition. The ground of your ordinary experience, that's Meister Eckhart with a little dash of Paul Tillich, right? This notion of a liberty that nobody can touch, this comes from his connections with the Tibetan Buddhist diaspora, in North India. All these different themes are crystallizing for him in the very last hours of his life, unbeknownst to him. Right? So I like to play with this idea, like, what's the next book that Merton, what would he have done next? Like, what would Merton have done or written next had he lived? And I'm really curious, like, because again, like, I'm not just trying to promote the book, but it's when you, I think these conferences are very important because they really give you the most extended, like, witness to these themes of where he was at in the last year of his life. And so much of it is about this interweaving of these types of consciousness. You know, that could have been his book, Types of Mystical Consciousness, by Thomas Merton. But this is somehow attainable. You know, this is somehow attainable. There's a promise here. All right, again, it's about practical implementation. He's very interested in practice and experience. It's not theoretical. Making sense? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Going back to the 5 sheaths or the 5 garments, what can you repeat what those 5 were?
Yeah. So this comes from one of the earliest Upanishads. Are you familiar with the Upanishads, the part of the mystical literature of the yoga tradition? This goes back 2,000, 2,500 years. There are a number of Upanishads. Taittiriya Upanishad is a very early Upanishad which lists specifically these types of koshas. So there's the Annamaya kosha, the physical sheath, literally translates as the food body. It's the food body. Then there's prana. Prana is energy or life force. So pranamaya, it's the energy body or the breath body. Manas is Sanskrit for mind. So manomaya kosha is the mental body or the mind body, the mental constructs. Vijnana maya, the wisdom sheath. So there's a wisdom body that's inherent into our sort of psycho-spiritual makeup. And then Ananda Maya kosha, the bliss body.
The wisdom one, it seems like a good thing.
Yeah.
And when you talk about peeling away all those 5 garments, we're getting rid of those good things, right? Or are those
All
neutral
good
in
things
this?
must go.
I'm sorry?
All good things must go. Simply because, so the greater context for this is the non-dual tradition of the Vedanta, the Vedic tradition. So the bigger sort of context for this model is that ultimately the Atman, the personal self or the soul, the Atman, the goal of the sort of yogic or the spiritual quest is that Atman needs to become identified with Brahman. Brahman is God in its most undifferentiated godness. And the purpose of the path in this non-dual tradition is to basically dissolve the individual self in the larger cosmic universal self, this non-duality. So in order to do that, you have to let go, eventually, of all of these layers of self because they're ultimately not this essential self or this core self. So even something like wisdom, which sounds like a very beautiful thing, you know, if you're in this kind of non-dual, apophatic kind of model, you say goodbye even to that. And if you're familiar with John of the Cross's ascent to Mount Carmel and the diagram of the ascent to Mount Carmel, the path is nada, 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 nada. And next to all of these nadas in John's diagram, it's even the cardinal virtues. So even you have to let go even of hope. You have to let go even of charity. You have to let go even of, you know, any sort of attachment to the virtuous life. in order to ultimately drop through the bottom of the ground to come out in God. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
We have to enter into the cloud of forgetting, to put it in the language of one modern Episcopalian sort of English mystic. Anglican mystic. Okay. Any other questions about the first part before we move on to October? Yes.
Where does centering prayer fit into this?
Yes. Was it before these explorations, or during, or after?
Great question. So centering prayer, like trademarked, like centering prayer, like TM, registered trademark, this doesn't exist yet in this chronology. Centering prayer was a response by Thomas Keating and Basil Pennington and William Menninger. It was a response in a post-Merton age. It was a response by them in the 70s and in the 80s to noticing how many folks were leaving churches, particularly the Catholic Church, to go east and to go explore Eastern practices because they were finding something that they didn't think they were finding in their own traditional organized religion. Many of you have probably done a little bit of that journey yourselves. So the centering prayer movement was like, hey, this type of contemplative prayer or mystical practice exists in the Christian tradition. We just need to polish it a bit and give it a little branding, and I'm sure that's not what they were thinking. But we need to simplify it and bring it forward in a way that people can, it's accessible, right? So that was the beginning of the recovery of texts like The Cloud of Unknowing, and that whole Paulist Press series, The Classics of Western Spirituality, started to be published, and I think starting 78 or 79 with Julian of Norwich, your other friend. So all of a sudden now there's a rebirth of interest in Christian contemplative and Christian mystical texts and traditions. All of a sudden it's like, oh, we've actually been doing this for a very long time. And centering prayer becomes a global phenomenon, that took Thomas Keating and others around the world, right? But that comes next. Merton kind of cracked this open, and then his other Cistercian confreres carried it out into the world in a much more public and popular way. Is that way too much information? Okay. Great. Okay. So let's go into, and here's one of my favorite images here. You've probably seen these images because they're in the Asian Journal. Merton with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And Chachal Rinpoche, Thomas Merton referred to him as the greatest man I ever met. Chachal Rinpoche is a Dzogchen master in the Tibetan Buddhist Nyingmapa tradition. And Merton wanted to study Dzogchen with him. Merton was very interested in Dzogchen. Dzogchen is a sort of a very high level of meditation, very direct tantric path to direct realization. And that's where Merton ends, his life. He speculates what would it be like to undertake a 3-year retreat, if he lived in the Himalayas. So this is the world that he was in, which is very interesting because then, several decades later, the Dalai Lama is able to visit Merton's grave during one of the Gethsemane encounters, which was a bringing together of Buddhist and mostly Cistercian and Benedictine monks at the Abbey of Gethsemane in the 90s. So that whole history of inter-religious dialogue has continued.